It's just like, at the end of the day, whether it's genocide or not, some really shitty things happen, and they need to be acknowledged, and they need to be dealt with. Always take it with a grain of salt when people say, oh, that's not a genocide, or that is a genocide. Most recently, this whole debate has sparked between, if you guys have seen on Twitter, it's kind of been this drama between Destiny, the streamer. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. Really tiny streamer, like very, very insignificant. And the Serfs. And the Serfs believes that Canada is committing a genocide right now. There is no debate amongst historians that, I shouldn't say there's no debate, but there's mostly no debate amongst historians that Canada, and in general, the colonial powers in the West committed multiple genocides against the Indigenous peoples of the Americas. And Canada did too. That's like not even a question. And I'm going to get into we can get into what happened and all that stuff. But the Serfs was claiming that Canada's still committing a genocide to this day. Like right now, today, they're committing a genocide, right? Destiny was like, no, bro, that's totally nuts. So, you're gonna get to hear from yours truly about who I think is more correct on this. But I'm hoping more so to arm you guys with the knowledge that you can go and help maybe encourage you to do some of your own research, guide you into some of your own research, and, come to your own conclusions. So now we're going to listen to a professor, and they're going to argue that Canada has engaged in a genocide against the Indigenous peoples.
I undertook a study on the question of whether the Canadian state is culpable for crimes of genocide. What is the legal meaning of the limited definition of genocide in the criminal code? So basically it means whether the Canadian state violates customary international laws on genocide. The acts of genocide that I focused on in my legal research was looking at the forcible transferring of children via the residential school system and the present-day child welfare systems in Canada. At the end of the legal research, it was determined that, yes, the Canadian state does violate customary international laws on genocide and that they are criminally culpable for crimes of genocide. Canada was instrumental in having cultural genocide deleted from the UNGC, or the Genocide Convention. When they were drafting the crime from 1946 to 48, they were helping to draft this crime in international law. It's there in black and white that Canada evaded the concept of cultural genocide.
Yeah, I don't really like the music in the back.
Government reports describe the residential school system wrought with abuse, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, mistreatment, inadequately fed, which are all euphemisms. A more accurate way to describe what happened in those institutions and what still takes place is torture, forced starvation, forced labor, sexual predation, and death.
There was forced labor. Even here in Ontario, the residential schools in Ontario, they had farms, and they would force the children to be working the farms. Literally, like chattel slavery.
Death by disease and dilapidated living conditions. Canada has not examined the legal issue of international laws on genocide in its own domestic courts, which leaves
but is this happening now? That is the question, right? Like these Indigenous schools have closed. So we'll get into the argument of what's happening now.
Because they have no recourse. We belong within the family of nations. We're subjects of international law. Why would the Canadian state go to such great measures to define genocide in international law or help and engage in crimes in its own domestic border? This is all about the land, because the state and society has benefited from claiming our lands, stealing our lands, claiming underlying title to lands that they don't have or possess. First, I think that the genocide needs to stop in all its various forms. What should happen next is that the peace and friendship treaties created between the Crown and the Indigenous nations or the original nations. For example, where I come from, the Nehiyaw or Cree, they should be implemented according to the original spirit and intent. I think the next
I don't think that's ever going to happen. Like the original treaties, I don't think they'd ever happen.
steps would be having an open discussion in Canada.
I agree, Debras.
And
I
also
agree.
globally, because this doesn't just affect Indigenous peoples and nations in Canada.
So, Canadian and international media are reporting an ongoing practice of forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada. Here's what you need to know. Now, whenever I hear this stuff, I always feel really skeptical because, like, whenever I hear about it, when I actually look into the situation, it's not really like that. Like, they'll consider, like, Planned Parenthood or something, like teenagers who are getting sexually active and encouraging them to practice safe sex. They'll consider that like sterilization and stuff. But like, yeah, we'll get into this. Okay. So in July 2017, the Saskatoon Regional Health Authority released the report of an external review commissioned after at least 4 Indigenous women reported in the media that they had been coercively sterilized in a Saskatoon hospital, mostly between 2008 and 2012. The report documented the experiences of 16 women, most of whom reported being coercively sterilized between 2005 and 2010, and noted that pervasive structural discrimination and racism in the healthcare system in general remains unmistakable. The pattern of systemic bias against Indigenous peoples in the provisions of public services throughout Canada, from the criminal justice system to the healthcare system, is well known and acknowledged by the government. Okay, so let's look into those situations. Saskatoon Health Region apologizes after Aboriginal women felt pressured by staff to have tubes tied. The Saskatoon Health Region is apologizing and changing its policies after 2 Aboriginal women felt pressured by medical staff and social workers to have tubal ligation surgeries. I don't think pressure is genocidal. I don't think that this would fit into forced sterilization. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong here. They made it pretty clear they didn't want me discharged until my tubes were tied, said Brandy, who had the procedure in 2010. They bug you and bug you and bug you. Pelletier, now 39, had just given birth to... we don't know the context. I'm interested. For all we know, maybe they were bugging her because of the health issue. Because, like, carrying the pregnancy was very dangerous for her. I know that they would often do that in a situation like that. Pelletier, now 39, has just given birth to her 7th child when the hospital social worker came to her... Okay, that's a fucking lot of kids. And asked her to sign a consent form to have the procedure. She refused. Her mother was raising her 6 older children in another community. Pelletier, who was and is a recovering addict in the methadone program and committed to a healthy life, was determined to raising her daughter herself. She didn't want the new baby to be raised as an only child, so she declined repeated requests by social worker and then by the nurse too. See, I know this from the Orthodox Jewish community. Encourages you to have lots of kids. Once you have 5 kids, it starts being very dangerous for your body to have children. So, like, I do think that there's a good health reason why they would be trying to sterilize. Like, it's kind of fucked up if true. However, it's not actually forced upon them. As nurse just said, pregnancy carries a lot of risk. Yeah, so, like, doctors pressuring someone, probably problematic to do. Like, you shouldn't be pressuring, but, like, different things can come off like pressure to different people. So, like, your doctor trying to be a responsible doctor could potentially come off like that. And I don't think that's anything close to, like, forced sterilization. Is it a result of the government policy or is it a result of the doctors themselves? Oh, Vera News, I don't think there's any actual government policy saying that women, Indigenous women need to be forcibly sterilized. If someone wants to correct me, please correct me on this. Peltier said that the social worker told her that 7 children was enough and she should just enjoy the baby and have her tubes tied. The woman also told Pelletier some women couldn't have children, so she should be happy with what she had. I mean, these are not things that people tell someone when they're trying to forcefully sterilize them to genocide a group of people. I can imagine that it's shitty for her. Nurses who came into her room during the night to check on her and the new baby also said she should sign the form. In the morning, a nurse told her an operating room was being prepared for her procedure. Yeah, I don't like that they were already preparing it without her consent. We can all agree that it's like a shitty decision, like, but at the end of the day, it's her body, right? Like, she can make choices for herself. The social worker returned along with a doctor who recommended Pelletier sign the consent form. Yeah, the lack of patient consent here is very disturbing. It's like, I understand them wanting to, right? This is what I'm leaning towards, is that this is just like really problematic, like, healthcare procedures. Like, I wouldn't consider this forcible sterilization or anything. It's just like really, it's like shitty healthcare, like where doctors in general can sometimes be like this. I was tired and frustrated and I signed it against my will to get them to leave me alone. Oh, she signs it. I'm divided on this. What do you guys think? The Saskatoon Health Region will have an outside investigator look into the Pelletier and Banab incidents and will release any recommendations publicly, Mann said in October. We will seek an external set of eyes to review the situation. The reviewer, who had not been yet hired, will also look at what is happening now in the region. She was told her fallopian tubes would be clamped, and she went into the procedure thinking it would be reversible, she said. So she also didn't realize it was permanent. On the table, I told them again, I don't want to. The female doctor asked the nurse if Pelletier had signed a consent form and was told she had. She then proceeded with the sterilization without further discussion. Yeah, it's pretty fucked up. So, even if this is fucked up, we would need more than this. So, the biggest argument in general of what's going on in a genocide is the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Everyone's so focused on the mass graves and they're a big deal, right? But the real, the real argument that Canada is committing a genocide right now is the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I know if you're Canadian, you're probably really familiar with the issue. If you're American, you're probably not. So the missing and murdered Indigenous women human rights crisis is disproportionately obviously affects Indigenous peoples in Canada and the United States, particularly First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And if you don't know, First Nations are a lot of people don't know the different groups. First Nations are kind of, usually when someone thinks of a Native American, that's usually you're thinking of a First Nations person, a member of the Sioux tribe. It's a member basically of the main First Nations amongst the southern part of Canada. Inuits are a different group of people. People often group them together. They're much more north. They're actually much more closely related to my people, which are, I think, Mongolians. They're usually much more north. People disparagingly have called them Eskimos. You're not supposed to use that term. And they tend to live in the much colder climates. They have a very, very different culture, and you don't want to group them together. It's kind of they're very different populations. And they've been treated differently, right? Anyways, there's an interesting story about the Inuit is that the Inuit often, they really rely off of wolf skins and wolf fur and stuff. Particularly the coat companies like Canada Goose. That's kind of how they've survived and thrived and done very well. And now Canada Goose, has become vegan. It announced that it's not going to be using real fur anymore. And so those tribes, those Inuit tribes are fucked. They're fucked. I actually don't even know what they're going to do right now. It's one of those weird, everyone thought it's a great move. Everyone on Twitter likes it, but then there's this whole other side of the people that fur industry was supporting. But anyways, then the other group are the Métis. Now, the Métis they're mixed. So they're mixed Indigenous and mixed white, mixed European. I don't know what you want to call it. They actually only recently got recognized as being Indigenous. There's a long fight for them to be recognized. They're particularly, I think, French. I think Lance is Métis. But yeah, so they weren't recognized for a really long time. Now they're recognized. They've kind of formed their own distinct culture and stuff. And that's why we use the term Indigenous. A lot of people say natives, but when you say natives, you're really only referring technically to First Nations, I think. So Indigenous just groups all together, easier term. So a corresponding mass movement in the US and Canada works to raise awareness of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls through organized marches, the building of databases, local communities, city councils, and tribal meetings, and domestic violence. So basically, there's a lot of missing Indigenous women, just to summarize it. A huge portion of missing. I think we'll get into the numbers soon. So they found that more than 1,000 Indigenous women were murdered over the span of 30 years, which is a lot. From 2001 to 2015, the homicide rate for Indigenous women in Canada was almost 6 times as high as the homicide rate for other women, representing 4.82 per 100,000 population versus 0.82 per 100,000 population. Now, people who argue that, missing and murdered Indigenous people is not a real issue or something, they'll say that's a typical rate for poverty, etc., right? Most of them are living in poverty. Basically, missing and murdered Indigenous women, it's always described as a crisis, but most recently, because Justin Trudeau, when he got elected, one of his big arguments was that he was going to do this big investigation, and this big outside investigation into the situation of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And the investigation finished this year. Big deal, right? And they released the report. We can read the report. It's available for anyone. You can look up Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report. And they said, and the report said that it was a genocide. That's why it's starting to be really popular, or I don't want to say popular, so we're starting to be really common to say that Canada is committing a genocide right now. Now keep in mind, these issues are really systemic in basically all of the Americas. But it's only Canada that even made an effort to look into it. So, like, even if you do think that Canada is committing a genocide, it doesn't mean that. So, like, say we accept Canada's committing a genocide against the Indigenous missing and murdered women, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that America's not doing it, or Peru's not doing it, or Brazil is not doing it, like, or Mexico's not doing it. It's just the only country that even tried to even look into it and investigate is Canada. So, yeah, you don't want to, like, single out Canada in a negative way necessarily compared to the rest of the American nations. But we also don't want to misuse the term. So, the report, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry Report, they cited Lemkin. We've read his definition, who coined the term genocide. Lemkin had explained that genocide does not exclusively mean the immediate destruction of a nation, but signifies a coordinated plan of different actions aimed at destruction of the essential foundations of life or national groups, with the aim of annihilating the group themselves. So they said, according to that definition, Canada's committing a genocide right now. The question is, like, who's killing these women? Is it the Canadian government? To my knowledge, the majority of these women are killed by their domestic partners. The majority of female violence anywhere, usually killed by their domestic partners or just by the men in their lives. So their argument, to my knowledge, and I might be totally wrong, I haven't read the entire report, and I wish I could read on stream, but my throat would kill me. Okay, we can read this. But their argument, to my knowledge, is that the government has facilitated a situation where these women are in such a danger on a regular basis. Okay, we'll read the introduction, right? The violence the National Inquiry heard about amounts to a race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, which especially targets women, girls, and lots of letters people. This genocide has been empowered by colonial structures, evidenced notably by the Indian Act, the 60 Scoop, the residential schools, and breaches of human and Indigenous rights, leading directly to the current increased rates of violence, death, and suicide in the Indigenous populations. But yeah, so their argument is basically the argument that I kind of prepared you guys for, right? That, like, the structures, the laws that were put into place, these acts that were put into place by the government of Canada that are still being perpetuated to this day, like, all are basically meant to put Indigenous people in a situation where they're being genocided, or at least a cultural genocide. Did they use the word cultural genocide, or was it genocide? I think it was genocide. The National Inquiry acknowledges that the determination of formal liability for the commission of genocide is to be made before the judicial body. So this is just a bunch of legal stuff. The National Inquiry does not intend to fully demonstrate all of the elements of a genocidal policy, since it does not have direct access to all of the evidence related to it. That's fair, right? But yeah, to prove that something is the case, you should probably have some evidence, but I understand that a lot of things are hidden. However, the information and testimonies collected by the National Inquiry provide serious reasons to believe that Canada's past and current policies, omissions, and actions towards First Nation people, Inuit and Métis, amount to genocide and breach of Canada's international obligations, triggering its responsibility under international law. This report is limited to a legal analysis of genocide, but the National Inquiry's findings call for a broader examination of other international crimes, including, in particular, crimes against humanity. So, cultural genocide is basically when you are trying to wipe out a culture, but not the people. And it implies that that's not a part of the word genocide itself. So that's why a lot of people don't like the term. Okay, I want to see, so what section? Genocidal conduct. So it's in section B. Section 3B. Ooh, what is the specific intent of the state? Let's get into the intent. So they think that there's intent. That's a huge claim, and I'm sure they think they have evidence for it. So let's go to that. Okay. So applicable law for genocide by killing. The underlying conduct, killing of members of the group, has been interpreted broadly by international criminal tribunals. The term killing includes all forms of homicide, and thus must be construed more widely than murder. Interesting. Now, I actually really disagree with this definition, but it totally makes sense legally. I actually think legally they're on point, but I still don't like it. So if you get into a car and you're drunk and you kill someone in the car, you're not going to be convicted of murder. You're going to be convicted of some kind of manslaughter, right? Okay. However, if you're beating someone up and you've got, like, your hot girlfriend, her name's Candy, okay? Candy's on your side and everything. And then this bro named Joe walks by. And Joe's like, oh, you're so fucking sexy, okay? And then slaps her ass. You're like, what the fuck? This guy just slapped her ass? That's like a sexual assault. Yeah, she's my girl. What the fuck? So then you punch him in the face. Totally rational thing to do, right? I'm kidding, not a call for violence, okay? It was a joke. So you punch him in the face, and then he punches you back, and now you're in a full-blown fist fight. Everyone's gathering around. You guys have all seen the situations, right? Okay, so everyone's gathering around. Everyone's like, fight. Big situation. And you're kind of getting inspired by the fight, all of this stuff. And you really just want to teach this guy a lesson. Like, you didn't want to, like, kill him or anything. But at one point, your punch misses. And maybe it goes for the neck. And then he just collapses. Like, his neck breaks. He collapses and he dies. Very relatable situation for all of us, okay? You would, in most countries, even though you didn't intend to kill him, you would be prosecuted for murder. Probably murder 2 or murder 3, depending on the laws in the country, right? A lot of people don't know this. Yeah, so you would, even though you didn't intend to kill him, and the state would not have to even prove that you intended to kill him. They wouldn't have to do any of that, right? All they would have to do is that you intended to throw that first punch. This is why you should never get into a fist fight, okay? Bad idea. Yeah, it would still be considered murder, right? And a lot of people don't understand, but like, oh, he didn't intend to kill him. The important thing is that legally, you intended to commit harm. You broke the law by trying to pull the punch. And by doing that intent to commit harm, that intent is enough for the murder charge. I actually disagree with that. I don't like that. I've never liked those rules. There's a lot of things, there's issues with those rules. It also disproportionately affects people of color, and there's a bunch of things associated with it, right? But I don't like it. But it's still the case legally. And they're actually, and this is one of the problems with that definition, because they're actually using that definition, right? Because if you apply that to genocide, and you say, okay, we intended to, say, forcibly remove you and move you to a different location. And then in the process of that, a bunch of shitty things happen. Or we intended to, or we stole some land, right? Or we put you in schools and then bad things happen. We didn't intend the bad things to happen, but we intended the first bad thing that caused the bad things. But yeah, so this is the argument, right? As long as so they actually don't need, Canada doesn't need intent to be going for like the actual kill or to be annihilating Indigenous people, but they need intent for doing other crimes against them. And then by consequence, it's just like that situation. And legally, I think they're 100% right. But yeah, that's the argument. And I think it makes sense legally, but I don't like it still. I think you can use that argument to justify calling anything genocide. Like anything, any kind of war, because wars always involve crimes. They always involve violence, right? You can start using that to define like anything as that. So I see a problem with that definition. I don't blame them for using it because I think that that's the consequence of the laws. So they're really just applying the law equally to Indigenous people, and in that way it makes sense. It's my opinion, but you are welcome to your own. I mean, one of the arguments is that if the effect is that like a bunch of people get wiped out, if the effect of that guy is that he dies, and he died because you punched him, like, it doesn't matter whether or not you intended to kill him, you intended to punch him, and it was the punch that led to the situation that he died. So it doesn't matter whether or not Canada intended to completely wipe out the Indigenous people. If Canada intended to demoralize the Indigenous people or take away land from the Indigenous people or do something else that was morally reprehensible, equivalent to the punching, I'm just using that as an analogy. I'm not saying it's not an equivalent, I'm just saying an analogy, right? Then it doesn't matter because your intent of a crime led to a genocide. So that's the logic. Yeah, so a lot of this is just explaining the legal kind of jargon. And they talk about the Indian Act. So stories of violence against women and girls and alphabet soup, people are rooted in past events and refer to the lasting generational consequences of these events. Testimonies of survivors suggest that colonial structures and policies, evidenced notably by the Indian Act, the 60s scoop, residential schools, and breach of human and Indigenous rights, directly led to the current increased rates of violence, death, and suicide in Indigenous populations. The thing is, I think you can actually use this argument, unless I'm misunderstanding this, and granted, I haven't read the whole paper. I haven't read the whole report. It's a lot. If you know someone who has a good summary of this, that would be excellent. Yeah, I don't mind reading it and summarizing it myself, but yeah, I would obviously have to do that off stream because reading this all out loud would kill my voice. But I actually think if this is their argument, I think you could use that argument to say that America is committing a genocide against American Black people. Like, you could argue that gang deaths for example, in intercities between Black people, is a genocide. If I'm understanding this argument correctly. And I'll take you guys through my logic for saying that. Now, I don't actually think that's the case, but I'll take you through the logic. The logic is the United States has historically oppressed Black people. They, were one of the prime funders of the slave trade. I mean, I'm not an expert on the details of, American Black history. I know much more about, the transatlantic slave trade from the African perspective. And then there were all these policies that were put in place to keep Black people down, like redlining. I mean, the limiting Black people, their ability to vote, purposely treating Black crimes as being much more harsher, reducing the structure of the Black family. There's so many things that you could say that, and that led to more people being involved in gang violence and poverty, and leading to that kind of stuff. And gang violence results in deaths, right? I honestly think that from what I've read, and I might be wrong, this is what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the entire paper over the next few days. No, it's not a paper, it's a report, sorry. And I also think that you can say that just because it's not a genocide doesn't mean that it's not awful and disgusting. This idea that something needs to be a genocide, we need to kind of take this thing out of our mind that something needs to be a genocide for us to consider it a morally bad thing. The fact that human beings feel like we have to go to the levels of something like the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide for us to be like, oh, maybe this is bad, is kind of really, that's almost more concerning than anything to me. Okay. However, this approach is increasingly criticized. First, it is not consistent with the general principles of interpretation laid down. Yeah, this is exactly what I was thinking that they were saying. As such, text can only be used as supplementary means of interpretation, either to confirm interpretations done in accordance with the ordinary means of the terms of the treaty in their context and in the light of the treaty's object and purpose, or if such an interpretation leaves the meaning ambiguous or leads to a result which is manifestly absurd or unreasonable. As we will demonstrate below in the analysis, interpreting genocidal intent as encompassing only physical and biological destruction does not accord with the ordinary meaning of the word destruction in its context, and in light of the object and purpose of the convention. Moreover, a restrictive interpretation of the term destroy leads to absurd results, particularly the forcible transfer of children, but also many non-lethal genocide conduct encompasses in the definition, which can hardly be reconciled with any of those aims. Yeah, they're laying it. This is much more of a legal argument about changing the definition of genocide, and I think it's a very rational one. But yeah, they're actually going against the UN definition of genocide, right? Because as I mentioned, the UN definition has to involve precedent, and to this day, there's never been a convicted court case of the word destroy not meaning kill. Destroy always means kill. The dude who coined the term genocide included cultural genocide as an explicit aspect. Yep, that's something we've talked about that. Yeah, actually calling something cultural genocide goes against Raphael Lemkin's original definition because he believes cultural genocide is genocide. So, using that term implies it's different. This reminds me of the trial of Derek Chauvin. Right-wingers were desperate to say they couldn't convict Chauvin for all 3 degrees of murder. That's interesting. Well, why would he say that? I'm interested to hear your argument. Is there a single country on earth that isn't committing a genocide if we start stretching what the word means? Honestly, I don't think so. Okay. The inclusive approach to interpreting the means of destruction is best exemplified by a trend of cases before German domestic courts and the European Courts of Human Rights, which has concluded that genocidal intent may be construed as including the destruction of a group as a social unit. That's interesting. Did you guys hear that? A social unit. I don't know why y'all what y'all have covered, so I'll just make a few quick points. Forced sterilization, kill the Indian, save the child, the theft. Yep. Yes, we have talked about all those things. So it's really interesting that they brought up the social unit. And I actually think it's a very interesting argument. After the Bosnian genocide, the German Federal Attorney General investigated approximately 131 cases of suspected genocide, many of which culminated in prosecutions. In 1997 Jorgik case, the higher regional court in Dusseldorf held that the intent to destroy a group taken literally as a part of the elements of the genocide crime includes more than the sheer physical biological destruction. If you take a bunch of blue people, right, and you forcibly sterilize all of them, but you don't kill anyone, you think that's a genocide? I think it's a genocide. So to me, I actually agree that destruction shouldn't be just considered biological destruction. Just literally just killing the person. I think like intending to remove that group in some way off of the earth. That's why I really like that final definition. Who was the final definition by? I think it was by John Cox. Yeah, John Cox. I liked his definition more. So he would actually agree. So I think that this argument is a better argument. So to me, focusing on murdered Indigenous women, if they're murdered by like their domestic partners, most of them, to my knowledge, are like most domestic violence, most violence against women in general is by the men in their life. I don't consider that a genocide. However, even if you could argue that like, you know, they were put into situations that led to increased domestic violence and all that stuff, like I don't think, because I think that you could use that to apply to argue that any form of oppression is genocide. And I don't like that, right? That means that ruins the definition. However, this argument I'm feeling a little more, particularly forced sterilization. Now, the question is, did forced sterilization actually happen? We know it historically happened. We have facts about it. Is it going on right now? So if you know about it going on right now, please link me some articles. I'm interested in reading about it. As we know, it's very hard to prove things that are going on in the present age, right? It's harder than the standard of what we would in the past. But yeah, so far, the only article I've read is this one. And to me, this didn't really define it that way, but it also is by the National Post. So it's like, National Post is kind of a right-wing-ish paper. Anyone know the section of where they talk about forced sterilization? Because I think that is, if you can prove that Canada put into policies into play that to this day are still like intentionally trying to forcefully sterilize Indigenous people, then yes, 100% I think that there is a genocide going on. Birth alerts are a bigger and more recent issue than sterilization. You think so? But their birth rates are much higher, right? They're like higher than in the past. I can definitely find evidence of that. I don't remember where, but there's a class action lawsuit against the Canadian government by the... Yeah, there's this argument, like this one where that involved the Saskatoon health government. But yeah, to me, like this isn't something that... Like this is like an issue with the Saskatoon health region. If this is widespread over all of Canada, then yeah, like 100%. But even this issue, it really seemed like she was being discouraged from... Like she was being, I guess, first of all, she wasn't forcibly sterilized, in my opinion. I think she was just heavily pressured, which is still problematic. But to my knowledge, like she was being pressured not because she was Indigenous, but because she had 7 children already. And I know that once you, from being in the Orthodox Jewish community, like once you have 5 children, they really start discouraging you. Like your doctor pregnancy becomes really, really dangerous. And your doctor starts to really, really discourage you from becoming pregnant. The First Nations population has been absolutely exploding since the residential schools closed. I have no clue if that's true. I can't confirm or deny. Can't confirm or deny that. Okay. Yeah, this is a good video. So this is basically about why they use the term genocide. Its use of the word has prompted discussion over definition and when acts of oppression and violence can be classified as genocide. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stopped in short of calling the disappearances and deaths of Indigenous women and girls a genocide on Monday, despite being called upon to do so. He couldn't call it genocide because it causes all these legal ramifications, as I mentioned, even if he genuinely does believe it privately. Hours later, he acknowledged the report's findings, telling a Vancouver crowd earlier this morning. Oh, he actually did end up calling it. Wow, okay. Earlier this morning, the National Inquiry formally presented their final report in which they found the tragic violence that Indigenous women and girls have experienced amounts to genocide. Justice Minister David Lametti said the federal government will leave the discussion of the term genocide to academics and experts like you guys, okay? It's all up to you. It's all up to you. So, Canada's Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, passed in 2000, offers a broader definition of the word genocide. That's interesting. I didn't even know about that. Saying genocide can encompass not only acts of commission, but omission as well. That's interesting. The Inquiry report cited Lemkin's work, noting that the lawyer explained that genocide does not exclusively mean the immediate destruction of a nation. Genocide, Lemkin described, is intent, rather, we've already discussed what Lemkin says. Naomi Sayers, an Indigenous lawyer based in Ontario, explained that Canada's report on the treatment of Indigenous people is indisputable.
For families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada, the National Inquiry's report and its 231 calls for justice is difficult to digest. But harder still is the possibility that after years of heartbreak and grueling testimony, little will come out of it, at least in the near future.
I'm sorry about the
I think that it's important for government and non-Indigenous governments and communities to listen to Indigenous people when we say this is what we need, and then they don't try to fit it within some political rubric or pre-existing framework.
It's been more than 3 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action, few of which have been fully implemented. Indigenous women from the Maritimes say they want to see Canadians own this report as a part of their heritage and their responsibility moving forward.
It would have been nice to see our premiers here today. And I think that's a piece that we need to do and work on in Nova Scotia, is make sure that the province of Nova Scotia and the provincial government know that this is their inquiry too. It's not just Indigenous women, it belongs to the province and the federal governments and our communities.
I'm really hoping that more supports are available for the families as a result of this inquiry, because that's a piece that's been missing for many people. They have not had the supports to be able to move on, which has incurred other traumas and intergenerational trauma within families.
Nova Scotia's minister responsible for the Advisory Council on the Status of Women promises that the National Inquiry's report will not sit on a shelf collecting dust.
It's a whole of government response, so we'll take some time to better understand what's in the report and what steps we can take to meet those recommendations.
Elizabeth McSheffrey,
They should go
Global
off of
News,
the Twitch.
Halifax.
Aristocracy community recommendations, okay? Okay, so Canada doesn't seem, by most accounts, to actively be genociding the Native population, but there's still systemic racism, systemic abuse in some areas. That's what it's coming to me, but like I feel like there's still more information to be coming out. And they have called it a genocide, and I think legally you can call it that. I hear the argument, but I personally don't. It depends on your definition of genocide. So I'm not telling you guys what to think. It all comes back to that initial definition. If you're like, if that definition sits well with you, for me, it's all about whether or not there are actually forced sterilizations going on, and it's widespread and systemic. If that's the case, then to me, I could call it something like a genocide, and it comes much closer. But I don't buy that initial argument that just because there was an intent to, for other crimes like the Indian Act and all this stuff, and that led to the situation with the murder of Indigenous women and that being a genocide, I feel like you could use that argument to say that any systemic racism automatically means genocide. And I think that is, I think that's a very huge, I think that's a little offensive to the term genocide. If you don't tell me what to think, then how am I supposed to form an opinion? Okay, here in the Aristocracy, we don't tell you what to think, okay? We tell you how to think. I could tell you that where my opinion lies is that, to me, it's all about, I don't buy that argument that they made in the inquiry. It's a legal argument, and to me, it's like legal jargon. That it's not a moral argument, it's a legal argument. And the legal argument, to me, is just, I don't buy it. And it's because I don't buy the idea that, if you threw the first punch and someone dies, I don't think that you should be convicted of murder if you didn't intend to commit murder. But that's a disagreement between me and most legal systems. And I am definitely in the minority there. I don't know what you guys what your opinions are on that. So how exactly should I think? Okay, this is how you think. You close your eyes and you bring up a subject. And then you open your eyes and you put on Vosh. Okay? You search Vosh to that subject. That's how you think. Naomi Sayers, an Indigenous lawyer based in Ontario, explains that Canada's record on the treatment of Indigenous people is indisputable. You can't debate that fact. Canada has a history of legislating Indigenous communities, Indigenous bodies, and Indigenous systems to essentially annihilate them and do away with them and erase them forever. Sayers noted that this has happened through both past and present Canadian governments through things such as enactment of Indian Act. Did the Canadian government want to remove Indigenous people from Canada historically? I would say it's pretty obvious, yeah. But wanting something and trying to actually make it happen with that intent are two different things. And we know historically they did enact things, right? I do think the residential school system can be qualified as genocide 100%. Though legally, there's a problem with that. As I mentioned, from the UN definition, you actually, with the precedent, there's no precedent for being able to consider residential schools a genocide, even though I would think from a historical perspective it is. So it's interesting. They pick when they want to use, they're lawyers, right? They pick legality when it's useful for them, and they they cherry pick when it's not useful for them. It's like, the truth is that we live in a country whose laws and institutions perpetuate violations of basic human and indigenous rights. These violations amount to nothing less than deliberate, often covert campaign of genocide against indigenous women, girls, and alphabet soup people. The reports added that in the Canadian context, genocide refers to the death of indigenous women in police custody, exploitation and trafficking of alphabet soup people, physical, sexual, and mental abuse, denial of status and membership of First Nations, forced removal of children, chronic underfunding of essential human services, coerced sterilizations, and more. To me, this is hard, right? Notice how she says coerced, sterilizations, not forced. But this is not just an issue of personal feelings about the word genocide. How are you ever going to hold the government accountable if they can convince you that they didn't commit genocide? The problem is that apparently today, the only crime a state can be held accountable for is genocide. I don't think that's true, Stepon. I feel like they can be held accountable for tons of other things. For example, right now the Canadian government is in tons of lawsuits against, there's tons of lawsuits against Canada and stuff. I guess you're thinking from a criminal standpoint. Right? That's what I'm thinking, not a civil standpoint. But I think even by a criminal standpoint, you can be. I have a good idea, guys. We should talk to a Canadian lawyer. That's what I'm going to do. So, from a legal perspective, I actually think they have a very good argument. I think we need to talk to a lawyer. Right? From a moral and intentional perspective, I don't know. Why genocide is the right word here. Bertie Farber of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network explained those upset over the use of the term genocide in the report have a limited and often misguided understanding of the term. Genocide, Farber noted, takes different forms. Taking First Nation children and sending them to residential schools is a form of genocide. The missing, murdered... Okay. So, they do not have to argue with me that residential schools 100% are a form of genocide. The report itself noted that Canada must own up to colonial genocide, which often goes unrecognized because of its consistent... I do agree that Canada needs to be more honest about what it did to Indigenous people historically. For sure. The insidious of gradual nature of obliteration of the Indigenous people and the lack of uniform national policy spearheaded by the totalitarian mastermind differentiated colonial genocide from our... That is a fucking grouping of words. Understanding of what constitutes a genocide, the reports read. Farber noted that in 2008 he visited Israel's Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial along with Jewish and First Nation leaders. We came out and both groups were very moved. We had a healing circle and they explained to us their pain, what it was like for them to be stolen away from their parents, have their culture stripped and losing a piece or two. There's a nation. Beyond the pain. I really have a hard time understanding any argument that Canada didn't commit a genocide with residential schools. So to me, that's not even up for debate. I wish they would have provided an argument. Okay. So can we all just say at least that the residential school systems were genocidal? They were genocidal by Lemkin's definition. They are not genocidal by the UN's definition. Because again, the UN, it involves their official definition, sure, right? But the definition involves precedent. There's never been a precedent of it. But I think there should be. Okay, but is Canada committing a genocide right now against the murdered and missing Indigenous women? Okay, so we're more divided on this. So most of you seem to be saying no. Some of you seem to be saying yes. The thing is if you consider what happened to the residential school system a genocide, but Canada still hasn't fully owned up to it. They still haven't done reparations or any kind of proper system to really make amends for the past. And they're still doing shitty things to Indigenous people. Is there an argument to be said that because of that, the genocide's still ongoing? GRP lover, in the end, what does it matter if it's a genocide or not, as long as we agree on the facts of the matter? You know what? I actually completely agree with you. At the end of the day, do I think that I haven't been convinced that the murder and missing Indigenous women issue is a genocidal issue. But I am convinced that the causes of it are systemic racism. And I do think that Canada has not done enough, to acknowledge its past with what it did. And it's very recent past with Indigenous. Like, the survivors are alive today. They're like generation, like X or whatever, what it's called. People born in like the 60s, 70s. Someone at the UN recommended Canada that we don't focus on the word genocide as much as we focus on fulfilling TRC's goals of reconciliation, calls for action. I think that is what we should be focusing on. Yep, Lehman, and I think that is the conclusion that I'm coming to. That I really think that, like, in the end, if there's any good that can come out of this debate, is I hope it just makes us pay more attention to what's going on with the Indigenous people. And it really depends on your legal parameters, right? If you think that someone punching first, I have to talk to I'm not a legal scholar or anything, right? Just putting that out there. So I would need to talk to a Canadian lawyer, right, who really knows what they're talking about. I could probably find that. Maybe I'll find that this week. But yeah, I would love to talk to someone about that kind of stuff, because right now it really seems that the argument they're using is the legal argument that we have in most countries about the punching first thing, right? Like, you punch someone, if they end up dying, it doesn't matter whether or not you intended to kill them. You still intended for the initial criminal act, and therefore you're still guilty of murder. But I think that is actually really unfair. And there are a lot of people, particularly people of color and a ton of oppressed groups that are literally on death row, death row for crimes like that, where they didn't intend to kill the person. And I think that that's bad. So I don't know if I buy that argument, but I can be convinced out of it. Either way, I think that we need to be bringing more attention to these issues, and actually, in general, I'm proud that Canada did a report and is actually investigating this. Because, people act like this issue isn't in the United States. It is. The United States just doesn't, they haven't even tried to investigate it. I want to listen to survivors from the residential school systems.
I got frightened when I was a little girl, when the principal used to beat up the other children, like boys. The boys got the most beating. They used to call it bench party, and it was usually done after supper. And that's where I got frightened, because I saw blood.
I remember when we had to shower.
I'm just warning you guys, some of this stuff can be really disturbing, okay? But I do think it's important to listen to the stories.
We, you only have to show me how to shower and clean and wash myself, how to wash my private and my, private parts of your body. You only have to show a kid once or twice at the most, but not every day. And have the supervisor come in there and basically take advantage of you,
I just remember arriving there and
hey, Sonia, thanks so much.
donning new clothes and, of course, getting a haircut and sitting in a classroom and being with other girls and witnessing my brother get punched by the supervisor.
My name is Alice Little Deer. I'm 78 years old. About 8 years in residential school.
My name is Raymond Mason. I'm 62 years old, and I attended residential school for 12 years.
I'm Madeline Dion Stout. I'm 62 years old. I'm from the Kihiwan First Nation in Alberta. I attended Blue Quills Residential School for 36 consecutive months. That would be 3 years.
Yeah, maybe post-partisan is a better word. I don't know, something like that. I try not to put myself in some kind of, obscure category.
In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them.
Oh yeah,
from
great
their
soul.
families.
Welcome to the stream.
Some people may say that this is hard.
So if you're wondering why I use a cartoon, I actually got started, doing my streams by, I got started initially as a public figure by debating Nazis. That was initially what I kind of got known for. And because of that, I met a lot of, and we were all anonymous doing that. And so it's really been important for me to remain anonymous, for my safety as a consequence of that. So this is why I use a cartoon.
But if we want to civilize them, we must do that. A federal cabinet minister, 1883.
I remember them taking me away from my mother and my stepfather. And I can hear them telling my mom that that was the best thing for me.
Yeah, I never voted for Trump. I'm not even American. Shut up.
Not to worry, I would be looked after.
Thanks, Salted Sea. I appreciate that.
Didn't want to worry us unduly and tell us and warn us that we are going to be separated for a long, long time with barely a visit.
I see him come around, Indian agent in a boat with the principal, then collect some children from the reserve. Mm-hmm. Then he would come back again.
Salted Sea, thank you so much for subscribing with Prime. Thank you. That means so much. Thank you. If you guys have your Prime sub, make sure you have to... I really, really appreciate it. You can only give it to one streamer. If you give it to me, it means a lot. It means a lot.
Take some more.
So the next day, I woke up with hundreds of total strangers, my size, my age, and not knowing, what are they doing with all of us here? Why are there's so many of us here, and that's where a lot of my whole life.
Yes, Lotus, Twitch Prime is free. Everyone, if you have Amazon Prime, then you get access to Twitch Prime for free. Feel free to send that over to your favorite cartoon.
Because
if you don't want to support Bezos and anything, you can also support me on Patreon. That means a lot. Especially like when I make YouTube videos and stuff, they get demonetized so often because the content I tend to cover tends to be really intense and challenging content and not very advertiser friendly. So yeah, I appreciate any support on my Patreon. If one of my mods want to put my Patreon in chat, yeah. All the help there means a lot. And what's cool is like 99% of that money goes to me, not to like some evil corporation.
I got strapped. I got beaten up for speaking my own native tongue. I even had my tongue pulled out and pinched.
Something that would happen. I'm just warning you guys. This is gruesome. So shut off your ears for a second if like you don't want to hear this. When they would speak their own native tongue, sometimes they would have like a needle put right through their tongue. Children.
My strongest memory there is when the little girl died beside me. She must have been about 6.
Oh my God.
I was scared why the parents were not there. That's what I was scared about. And I knew they wouldn't feel comfortable for not being there when their daughter is dying.
And do you know why they weren't there?
They were never notified.
So it's been a known thing in the Indigenous communities for a really long time where, like, remember I told you guys that the death rate in Indigenous schools was higher than for Canadian soldiers in World War I? But there was no, like, actually measured process of how they handle these deaths. So usually the deaths were, like, they weren't necessarily... I think most likely they weren't necessarily like intentional deaths, but they were, they were put in situations where the conditions were absolutely terrible, where they would get diseases, they would be covered in lice, like they were also had severe malnutrition, like some really, really bad stuff. They were also worked really intensely, like the Ontario residential schools, they were literally forced to labor in farms and they were fed terrible, like they had awful conditions. So the death rate was really, really, really high. And if someone could find the actual number. So a lot of times, like these families, like, so they would know that, like, so they would just get notified, like their kid's missing. And so all these kids would be missing. But in reality, they were dead and they were just thrown into a mass grave, not given proper burials and stuff. And now all these mass graves have been uncovered, like they're being uncovered slowly. Like they're finding more and more schools, like with them just having these policies of these mass graves. And because so many schools have these mass graves, that really means that it was like a larger policy. Remember, it's something that we always look for when we're talking with genocide, something like consistency amongst a larger region. Really, really gross. Children, too. And so, like, and the families wouldn't be notified that their kid was dead. They literally were just told that they were missing. They never even got to mourn their child properly. This is the real discussion, not whether genocide applies as a label. Well, It's a mix of two, right? It depends. Like everyone, there's obviously like two sides. Like the label aspect is something that people have been talking about a lot. So I wanted to get into that for a bit. But yeah, that's particularly what's really, really harmful about it. And that's why people are making such a big deal about the mass graves. It's not like that they weren't killed all at once, right? To our knowledge, hopefully. But they were just treated like completely disposable. The condition, so like the death rate, so there's just so many would die. Like your kid would be sent to a residential school and they'd just be like, oh, they're missing. And then like 20, 30 years later, we find out that they're in some mass grave. Just thrown in like nothing. And just keep in mind also with Indigenous communities, they often have very strict rules with how they handle death. Most cultures do have very strict rules with how they operate and handle bodies and stuff. And that's very important for like, you know, their I don't want to say post-life life, but the afterlife and a lot of traditions associated with that. So it's like that stuff is a really, really, really big deal when you're not given proper burials too.
Indian children in the residential schools die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this does not
That's an understatement.
Justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem.
Oh, that's a really nice terminology there.
Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs.
At that time,
interesting fact, Ryerson University in Toronto. Yeah, Ryerson University is named after Ryerson, obviously. The guy is kind of credited for creating the modern education system. Guess what other education system he created? The residential school system. So now, like, everyone wants to get rid of his statues and stuff, and I totally understand. Like, why would you want to, like, I wouldn't be wanting to walk around with fucking Himmler statues around. Yeah, so people are getting rid of that, and conservatives are getting really upset about it. They're like, oh, like, you're removing history and stuff. It's like, why would you want to go to school with that shit? And your school's named after that person. But it causes a lot of problems, right? Because as we've talked about, a lot of the names that we've named our places after, like a lot of those people have committed a lot of shitty things. So it brings up a question of what morals do you judge historical characters by, but that's for another.
They never told us that our sisters were across a hallway. And
yeah, I agree with you, Phoenixy.
I didn't know that for the longest time. Then I spotted my sister, Nora, and I was so glad and so hysteric, and I went running to her and I reached onto her, you know, and just hugged her, and I was just shaking, like, you know, and terrified. And I was wondering why she was pushing me away. I didn't realize that we weren't supposed to know that we both lived in the same place, and we weren't allowed to speak to each other. We weren't allowed to talk to each other. And I can remember the principal grabbing a hold of me by the hand, you know, and I was jumping off the floor like that, and he stripped me. And he started whacking me with a long, webbed strap.
And guys, keep in mind, right? Indigenous peoples in Canada have a higher alcohol rate, they have a higher crime rate, they have a higher poverty rate, like all that stuff. And we also know that physical punishment, or corporal punishment, I forget the right term, for when you're raising children actually directly leads to those outcomes. It's being demonstrated regularly by science. So, like, I could totally see the connection there, for sure.
He was setting an example that, you know, if you do this is what's going to happen to you. Like, and all the other boys were watching, and the girls were still going through, you know.
Their education must consist not merely training of the mind, but of a weaning from the habits and feelings of their ancestors, and the acquirements of the language, art, and customs of civilized life.
Do you guys think, okay, interesting one, do you guys think people have a right to the history of their ancestors and their culture? Because I've heard a lot of people say that they don't understand that. They don't agree with it. You're not sure what that means. How else would I explain it? Do they think that like something like someone's culture or their history is like a human right, the same way water and, you know, and having a house over your head and like bodily autonomy is a human right?
Edgerton Ryerson, 1847 Report for Indian Affairs.
Visits from my parents were...
What about ancestral lands? Yep, that brings up an interesting argument, right? I think that I don't think anyone technically owns land. I mean, that's the kind of language that got us into like Zionism and stuff too. It can be a little problematic.
Very rare, but I do recall one visit when my mother and father came. And
yep, it's hard to draw a line.
I remember specifically my mother's red tam, that splash of color. I remember her getting out of the wagon, and I was crying already watching them because I was missing them already. They hadn't even walked through the door yet of the residential school, but I was missing them already. And when they were actually leaving, I cried until my nose bled.
And you learn pretty quick after getting those kind of beatings. Not strapping, it's literally beatings, you know. And ever since that day, I tried to run away. And I made friends with a guy by the name of Donald Atkinson from Rosa River First Nation. And we planned, to take off. And when we got caught, we paid for dearly, you know. Not only the RCMP gave us a
I'm sorry that you're so hot.
The bigger boys that was helping them.
Are you angry at your parents that they made you go to school?
Yeah, of course I'll return the favor.
Sometimes I would think about them, I get mad for all giving me here, sending me over there where all the bad treatment is. And,
you know what's the worst part about like surviving these residential schools is you come through them and you probably feel like you've just been through a genocide, right? Like the situation, how traumatizing. I mean, I was fucking traumatized watching Matilda, okay? So I can only imagine how fucking vile this shit was. And you come out of that, and then the country's not recognizing it as a genocide. No one's recognizing it as anything. They're just like, oh, like, it's just like, the schools were a little bit harsh, guys. They're just a little harsh. When you were literally, there was forced labor, there was a higher death rate. You literally knew people, there were bodies around you. That was and it was like, oh, it was just a very strict school, guys, okay? You know, it was kind of like Hogwarts, but like, just a little more intense. That to me is almost the worst. That's the worst, is how we remember things. Like, because that's got to feel like gaslighting. You know your experience, and no one's listening to you. And no one's acknowledging it. And on top of that, there's no paid reparations. Look at this, probably like permanently damaged them. These traumas, we know these cause permanent damage, and there's no reparations or anything offered. Now I think there's been a lot of lawsuits. Ironically, the Canadian government's still fighting against them. But you know what's interesting? What's going on right now is a bunch of Catholic churches are literally just being set on fire. Like, they're just being burnt down. Like, legit, this is really happening. Like, right now, a bunch of Catholic churches are just being, like, r/Catholicism is very upset about it. But this is kind of crazy. Just, so in, like, literally 2 more churches, there are already two Catholic churches. So 4 Catholic churches have been burned. The majority of the people that were perpetuated, that were running the residential schools, it wasn't actually technically the Canadian government. The Canadian government, I think, sponsored the system. But it was run by the United Church, which is a church in Canada, and the Catholic Church. But I think it was run by someone else too. I forget who. Someone can remind me. But yeah, so literally, 4 Catholic churches have been burnt and like have just gone up in flames. I don't think it's coincidence, especially after finding the most recent bodies. But are the people currently in charge related to the action? I don't think so. Though some of them were pretty recent. Some of them were in like the 90s. No, I doubt most of them are, but you represent an institution. It's important to apologize.
The entrance of St. Paul's Co-Cathedral Thursday night, and this incident has just brought up mixed feelings in the Bridge City. Donna Heimbecker took these photos just after 6 p.m. when she saw the woman and her family who painted them being spoken to by police. She was going for a walk, but drove past the church about 2 hours later, and it had been cleaned up.
For them to clean it up right away tells me that they're embarrassed, they're disappointed.
Of course they are.
These feelings are understood by Saskatoon's Roman Catholic leaders following the discovery of an estimated 751 unmarked graves at the former residential school on Cowessess First Nation.
Anger is legitimate, anger, and it needs to be heard, and you can't force someone through their anger and all that is with it.
The bishop believes there were parishioners in the church when this took place. Mark Hageman's concern is that if this anger turns into violence. He notes work continues between the church and the Indigenous community on where to go from here.
Prayer shapes action, but we need to move beyond prayer to action. And so we pray hard and then try to work hard.
The Saskatoon Police Service responded to calls about our demonstration outside of the church. It says 2 people applied the paint, but neither of them have been charged. Kyle Benning, Global.
Yeah, so there have been like multiple churches burnt. Look at this, is insane.
A terrifying Easter Sunday scene at the only church in St. Teresa Point.
One of the oldest buildings in
Lyle Wood shot this video.
I was an altar boy there, and I got my communion.
Oh, Beast to Beast, thank you so much for continuing the gift sub.
I was married there.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Losing a family member, a community, when that church, when you're watching the church burn down.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. I don't know, man.
Meetings.
Here, them to be strong. I had always told them to be strong, to be able to take it like the other children.
So you sent 11 kids to residential school?
Mm-hmm.
How many of them do you think were strong through that?
None of them. None of them.
What about your children? How do you think it affected them being in residential
Well,
school?
like I said, a little bit crazier than they went.
Wait,
than
guys,
before they went
why are you guys debating? What's going on?
to school.
Hey, Small
Their
Glorious,
mind was
welcome to
a
the
little
stream.
bit more intact, staying at home with us. They knew how to hunt ducks, and they knew how to fish, and they knew how to snare rabbits and pick blueberries. Today you don't see that.
And you think that's the school?
Yeah. Everything destroyed in our world.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't bother white people. White people bothered me.
Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. The aim of education is to destroy.
Oh, God, it actually makes me cringe. That makes me cringe so hard.
The Indian. Nicholas Flood David Report, 1879.
There are 3 reasons why I think residential schools are a blot on the Canadian landscape. 1 is that we became strangers in our home and native land. 2 is that nurturing relationships between parents and children were severed. Residential schools were a frontal attack on parenthood. 3 is that it added to the mental stress, our mental stress in a very real way.
My name is Michael Loft. I'm from Ganawagi. I'm 55 years old, okay, and my dad attended residential school for 11 continuous years in Spanish Ontario. He says, and once he told me a story where they were so bored, they were in I think the cafeteria, and they would just walk in a circle, you know, because they couldn't just go run around, you know, willy-nilly all over the residential school just because school was out. They had to be controlled, I guess, had to be contained, and so they would walk in circles, you know, in the cafeteria, round and round and round and round, to deal with their boredom.
My name's Lorena Fontaine. I'm 38 years old, and both my parents and grandparents went to residential school. I was at a conference that my mom was speaking at. She was giving the keynote address, and she started talking about her residential school experience during her speech. And and that's how I found out. Well, I was, of course...
Yeah, I do think that they're considered genocide. Though you could argue that according to the UN definition, because the UN definition also includes legal precedent, it's not. But I think that that's the wrong definition.
I was shocked and appalled, and I just felt so terrible for her. I felt frozen when I was listening to her. And it wasn't until after she finished speaking that I started thinking about our family life. I started thinking about the abuse that was very prevalent when I was a child. And I started putting connections together.
He never knew when he was going to get hit in residential school. That's the thing. So he lived like in fear of getting hit. You break a rule, you get whacked, you know. So it was unpredictable. You know, you couldn't, you could try to learn the rules as best as you could, but I mean, you're a kid, you know, you'd mess up and whack, you know. So there was that unpredictability that he brought home too. And the same thing with us. We didn't know what was going to happen, you know, next. So it was scary.
Yep. So a lot of the victims would end up becoming abusers themselves in their own families, right? This is unfortunately the effect of a lot of the stuff.
I was raised by parents who never had a childhood, and they didn't have any parents as role models. So we were vulnerable children. And a lot of us were abused ourselves as young children. And I also realized at that point that one of the people who abused me in my family had been a residential school survivor, a family member.
Yep. Yep, exactly.
And
this is the concept of inherited trauma, right? My grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, right? He went through something incredibly traumatic. I do plan on reading his story out sometime on stream, but he went through something awful. And he ended up becoming a physical and emotional abuser of both my father and my grandmother. And he's not remembered fondly in a lot of ways, which really is hard for me to say, right? Because of that. But he'd gone through a lot, and that shit messes you up in a lot of ways. And a lot of people don't talk about that inherited trauma. But yeah, that stuff gets inherited to my dad, and then my dad brings it to me. It's just natural.
I understood why now. Why I was abused.
Yeah, just to clarify, my dad never ever hit me. I realize it kind of sounded like that, but I know my dad always fought with himself to do that. Like, he was always fighting with himself to never, he always had those urges and stuff like that because that's how he was raised. And yeah, and that was a huge struggle for him.
The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and to assimilate the Indian people in all respects. Sir John A. Macdonald, May 2nd.
Yeah, and my dad's goal was to stop that cycle of violence, right? Because he knew how much it got past his grandmother. But yeah, I could still see the urges. There's shit I did, like, where, like, I knew my dad. I could see it in his face that he wanted to fucking kill me in that moment. And it would take all of his self-restraint to not act on it. And yeah, because so much of this stuff gets, like, innately put in you when you're traumatized as a child yourself.
1887.
He got out, you know, like everybody gets out at 16, and he eventually made his way to Aguizal.
It's actually a known problem with other Holocaust survivors, and I'm sure this translates to a lot of other atrocity survivors when it comes to food. So descendants of Holocaust survivors have a much higher rate of eating disorders, whether overeating or undereating or bulimia, stuff like that. And I know I always struggled with eating disorder. I'm pretty sure my mom did. My father definitely did. My brother does. Like, yeah, it's so common within descendants of Holocaust survivors. Yeah, and it's because of, like, you develop a very unhealthy relationship with food when you're in a traumatized malnutrition kind of situation. And yeah, and that you end up translating a lot of that stuff down, you know, through the generations.
To his home, and he told me that he couldn't connect with them. He couldn't connect because he couldn't speak the language. He didn't understand.
Yep. They would so-called, the goal of these residential schools was to take the Indian out of the child, right? Indian out of the child. That was always the attitude. Save the child, kill the Indian. And what ends up happening is their whole community were Indians, right? And I'm using Indian because that's the terminology that was used at the time. Obviously, it's the incorrect terminology. You're supposed to say Indigenous. But their entire community was Indigenous. Their parents were Indigenous. They spoke a different language. They followed a different religion. Suddenly, they come out of these residents. They can't connect to their community. And then now they're supposed to connect to their abusers, to the Canadian community. Can you imagine how lonely that is? the effects of the system is just so they can't even talk to their parents, right? They've been completely ostracized from them. And it causes tons of problems. Someone fucking said that when I used the word Indian, it was the equivalent of using the N-word. And I was like, I know it's the incorrect term, but I don't think it's like historic, but like I still hear people regularly, like we still have to refer to things like the Indian Act and stuff. Like they're literally called in the Indian Act. And I know it's the incorrect term, but if you're trying to not be anachronistic and you need to use the terms that people were using at the time, and to my knowledge, it's not considered a slur. It's just an incorrect term. Yeah, no, like I got like, and then this person was like spreading like everywhere. Like they went and harassed me everywhere, like on YouTube, on my YouTube comments. They went and harassed me in Demon Mama's stream and like everyone's stream. Like they were like following me, telling everyone that I use like a slur against Indigenous people and stuff. I wasn't even using the term Indian, like it wasn't like a genuine description. I was just trying to explain what I was talking about. But yeah, I don't know.
The culture. So he couldn't take it, you know. He was frustrated. He was going nowhere. So he went back to the residential school for one more year because it seemed like that was home now. That was home, and that's where he could, you know, they spoke his language, and so that's where he went.
I grew up not knowing my language, and in fact, I kind of felt a bit ashamed about our language and our identity because it seemed like they were, meaning my parents and my aunts and uncles, were ashamed too in some way because they didn't want to talk about it and they didn't want to share with us about who we were.
There was a lot of fear. I think the fear that they put in him, the terror that they put in him. I mean, he managed to bring that with him, and it went into our family, you know. And I learned terror and fear and all that.
Keep in mind, and these stories are very, I don't want to say whitewashed, right? But they're the more chill stories, right? Because this was put on television and all this stuff like 7 years ago. So they're not like, yeah, so there are way worse stories. So these are considered the chill stories by comparison with some of the stuff that I've read. It's just like some of the bad stuff, it's like you literally can't put it on television. It's that bad. And it's one of the frustrating things about Twitch's TOS because I want to teach you guys about the details of some of the shit that happened. I think out of respect to the victims and the survivors, I need to talk about the details of what happened. But like, if I really get into like gruesome details and some of the really hard stuff, it's like Twitch is literally going to like, you know, I'll get in fucking trouble. It's really annoying. And on YouTube, I'll get demonetized and shit. Very frustrating. It's very frustrating that like, this segmenting that like me teaching people about genocide and teaching people about history is grouped with actual people who are still trying to perpetuate that genocide, like Nazis. Like me teaching about Holocaust and anti-Semitic imagery is grouped with people who are like who are literally perpetuating that anti-Semitic image. Like it's considered the same thing by Twitch. How fucked up is that? It makes me so angry. But yeah, I don't know. I just wish there was a better way that we could do that because honestly, like this is a modern way that people are becoming educated and we need to fix that system. It's really, really frustrating. You are not Semitic. Okay, thank you, Slippery. It's a great, it's great. You know the term, you know no one is Semitic, okay? Semite is literally a social construction by racists. Just so you know, Slippery. Okay.
As well, as a child.
I don't speak Yiddish. What the fuck?
I put fear in my sons too. That's all I knew.
Okay, Slippery, I know what you're doing, right? You're going to try to argue that Jews like aren't from the Middle East or something like that. Yeah. And so you can take your anti-Semitism like out of here. All the facts completely disagree with you. Literally, genetic testing disagrees with you. You are literally just buying into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So, yeah. You can go bye-bye.
For doing something that was right, I would put fear in them, you know.
Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic and there is no Indian question and no Indian Department. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, January 1st, 1920.
Generally, the survivors of residential school do not commit suicide any more than the general population. Okay. It's the children of the residential school survivors who commit suicide in incredibly high numbers. You know,
that's interesting. That's actually
6 to 7 times, the provincial average. Okay.
It might just take one person to start talking about it, or perhaps
that could be explained that suicide rates as a whole have gone up significantly. So like residential school survivors, children, they're going to be a part of the next generation. And the next generation as a whole has a much higher suicide rate.
A family to start talking about the fact that there is abuse, and the reason why there's that abuse is because of the residential school experience.
Yeah, Mr. Vings, I agree.
That, we're not abusive people by trade. We're not, we weren't born that way.
Sadly, people have harassed Eris Freezing Indian when covering Indigenous issue, but she has to, because the word is still being used today by the government and acts in place. Yeah.
And to be able to, I think families need to be able to realize that they're not alone, that none of us are alone anymore, that we have each other, and that it's okay to start talking about it.
We don't have the monopoly on pain and hurt, but we have and have carried a disproportionate share of it over time. And I would
It's a good way to put it.
Like us to move forward, not to erase our memory of who we are, because residential school is certainly a part of who we are. I'd like us all to be a part of a team that really makes a lasting difference for...
It's just weird, like they try to frame the schools as being like these like really nice schools, like look, we're providing free education, this is great. Like this is how it was sold. Oh, like this is like free education, totally provided for, totally fine, sure, your child just do some forced labor to make up for their food, but that's not a big deal, right?
Because I knew my brothers, my 2 elder brothers were going to school. I heard about residential school. When they told me I had to go to residential school, I was happy. I wanted to go in.
MC can't access the stream.
My mother took me. It must have been a Monday morning, I guess. And everybody was at school. So I sat with the supervisor of the boys by myself for the day. I was allowed, there was a big pile of comic books. That's what I read the whole day. She didn't bother me the whole day. And then the following morning, the supervisor called me to the office. I had long hair. Long hair. I think it was braided. When I came out from that office, I was bald.
There's something that's so vile about shaving someone's head. It just like, it just automatically makes me feel disgusted.
Then I got myself a number. I don't know, I think I was number 3. That was my first number at residential school. I was always number 3. My clothes were always number 3. Yeah.
Did you ever see that electric chair?
Yep. I sat on it one time. Yeah. It was a steel chair with a battery in the bottom, I think, and wires, and then
oh my God.
You had to hang on to the bars here, and then you had to crank up the power. And we tried to hang on for as long as possible. I don't know how long it took, but I couldn't do it. It was too strong for me at that time. Yeah.
Do you remember anybody being punished on it?
I don't know. Lots of things happened at school that I'm not aware of. Even that whip was a miniature cat o' nine-tailed, I think it's called. It's just a short one, but it still has the
cat o' nine-tailed. Oh my god.
steel things in it, and it could rip you apart. There were 3 boys that ran away. They were brought back. They were called out boys at the boys' room.
Bobbin?
And each boy got whipped in front of us.
This isn't the time for kings.
And right in the bottom. And it just ripped their skin. It made them bleed from broken skin. Yeah.
Yeah, I can put a trigger warning. Aiko, thank you so much for that raid. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're talking about Indigenous genocide and the residential school system and the definition of genocide and all that stuff. We covered it for a few hours. Now we're hearing residential school survival stories and learning about residential school system in Canada. Yeah, thank you so much for gifting that sub. Guys, please, everyone follow Aiko. She is absolutely lovely. Fellow Jewish Asian streamer.
There were all kinds
New
of
viewers don't know what they're getting into. Yeah, I'm just warning you guys. We are dealing with really challenging subjects. So content warning. We're hearing abuse stories, so this is intense. Okay.
stuff we were exposed to. Not only the chair, not only the whip, other stuff too. Whatever they can find, they brought it to the residential school. You know, it wasn't just physical abuse, sexual abuse that happened. There was also emotional, mental, and spiritual abuse. When I was there was a big windows in the boys' room. I could look out on the window, stand at the window, and I could see my house across the river every day. I was not allowed to run home to visit 6 days. I was only allowed to visit on Sunday afternoons.
I know this content is challenging and I know it's hard, but I feel like out of respect for the survivors and the victims, I feel like it's really important to sometimes, like, for me, it's important sometimes for me to put myself through some pain and mental anguish, to hear the truth. To me, it's like the least we can do for the survivors is listen to their stories. You know? And I'm not telling you what to do with your mental health. Like, you're the #1 judge of your own mental health. But to me, the truth is just so important. And this happened in my country. And to this day, Canada has still not properly, made amends for it. And Indigenous people are still, to this day, affected by the effects of residential schools. I mean, the most recent one was only closed in the 90s. So, yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's important to listen to it. I'm the #1 judge and executioner on my own mental health, yeah. If you can you spare a moment to look into the Pine Ridge and White Clay situation in the U.S.? With all this coming to light, I would like to bring awareness to the abuse that's going on there. Yeah.
About 3 hours, and then I had to come back to residential school. I could see my house, my parents. I wasn't allowed to go. And that's like, abusing a dog. Throwing a steak at a dog, you go through it and you pull it back. Well, that was the way I thought. How come I can't go home? It's only there. That's emotion, I was not allowed to learn emotion or even love, I guess. My brothers were not allowed to associate with me. I guess one of them was in the
no problem.
intermediate,
Bad
the other
practice.
was
I know,
from
like,
the
not
senior
everyone.
grade,
If you're having a really bad day, it's probably not
but
the
we were
content
not
you're
allowed
willing
to
to
mix.
engage with.
We were separated in the age categories. Even my sister was across the room, but we were not allowed. And we were not allowed to visit our parents.
Oh my God,
Only
Eris,
on
did you see John Doyle was so upset with my debate with him? No, I didn't see that debate.
Sunday afternoons for 3 hours. And if they were busy with other community stuff, we could only sit at the house waiting for them to come home. By the time they come home, I had to be back at the residential school. That's what they were doing, and you could, there was no Cree language speakers who were working there, like supervisors, teachers. They were all English-speaking people. You couldn't learn the language. And even the students that were there were just speaking English because most of them were happy to be speaking English. They didn't want to learn, they weren't proud to speak Cree. For some reason, I was able to maintain.
Well, you see, they're being taught that their own culture is uncivilized and is terrible and lower and all these things. So, of course, they're not going to want to learn their own language. They'll see, like, what's the use in it? If that's what you're being taught your culture is, like, why would you want to participate in that? It's gross.
The Cree language, I was always using it, and the other kids were laughing at me because I couldn't speak English. Yeah, that's what happens. There was no effort to maintain the Cree identity. You were made fun of if you identify with the bush. They just wanted you to turn white. They showed us the difference. There was no equal treatment. There was always superior, inferior.
I went to a Jewish school and I was taught French.
Teachings. Well, I always hear about that word reconciliation, but I never understand that word. Even if someone explained it to me, it just goes one ear and out the other. So I don't know what that word means, reconciliation. There's ways of maneuvering around that big word, that reconciliation word. They can't even shake your hand, they can't even hug you, they don't want to do anything with you to show family love. It's not there. It's just...
I can understand it. I can understand French, but I can't. I have a hard time speaking it because I hate the way language is taught in schools.
And saying, yes, how are you? And that's it. You don't even bother to answer, how are you? Because they don't care, how are you?
America had residential school systems too, to my knowledge. The Serfs still, I think, considers what is going on right now a genocide, and it's something that, like, I know residential schools were a genocide, and I could totally buy that. But yeah, I still have a harder time with understanding, at least like with the definition of genocide that I connect with the most. But I think legally, I think they have a good argument. It's just like, at the end of the day, whether it's genocide or not, some really fucking shitty things happen, and they need to be acknowledged and they need to be dealt with.